graphed the percent change of GDP and OPH-NFB for the 1960s decade. The dates are the independent variable x on the x-axis on the bottom, while the percent change is the dependent variable on the y-axis vertically. The dates are measured yearly, while the percent change is measured quarterly. The relationship between the two variables is almost coincidental for the entire decade, except when OPH-NFB takes a jump or leads in 1961 and 1967.
The graph shows that throughout the 1960s, GDP stayed relatively the same. However, both personal savings and domestic investment did have little changes. One of the biggest changes and dips of the decade was in the beginning, in the recession of 1960 to 1961, which lasted 10 months, and was defined by a high unemployment rate and a low GNP rating. Throughout the beginning of the decade, we can see that the variables are coincident. However, from the middle point onwards, we can see that they begin to lead and then lag with GDP.
The Vietnam War began prior to the 60s, but the major years of fighting were in this decade. The United States joined the Vietnam War effort in the early 1960s, which had a major effect on our economy. This war, like all others, increased our jobs and GDP because of the greater amount of government expenditures. The war lasted throughout the decade, which kept the economy stable and led to a very prosperous time in America.
The Cuban Missile Crisis, which occurred in October of 1962, was the event that brought the Cold War closest to full-scale nuclear war. The USSR had sent nuclear missiles to be set up on Cuba, less than 100 miles from U.S. soil. People in Florida were freaking out. The embargo placed on Cuba greatly reduced U.S. exports. JFK and his staff were in crisis mode for 13 days, trying to negotiate an agreement with USSR higher-ups. People living near the Gulf flocked to grocery stores and bought emergency supplies, including bottled water and flashlights. After a resolution was found, the Cold War began to thaw and tensions never got that high again. In 1962, unemployment was hovering at 7% and people were looking to JFK to lower it. Some wanted him to launch a series of public works to help juice up the economy, but Kennedy didn't think that was wise. Then scandal struck when U.S. Steel raised its prices just after Kennedy had personally settled a dispute between the company and its labor force. Kennedy was quoted saying that all businessmen were sons of bleeps. This, as well as the grand jury assembled to get to the bottom of the scandal surrounding U.S. Steel, caused many people to believe that JFK was attempting to restrict big business. This assumption led to a stock market drop. In order to prevent further economic downturn, Kennedy suggested that he was considering large tax cuts targeting mainly big businesses. This helped to settle the economy and keep it growing.
The JFK assassination. Lyndon B. Johnson took over after Kennedy's death and was able to pass his bills without much trouble. This put Kennedy's vision of an America without poverty into motion. These bills helped to really ignite the economy and kick things into gear. Although Kennedy's death ended up aiding in his social and economic plans finally being passed, the stock market dropped the day that he died. British invasion. The Beatles actually originated from Britain, but were a very important part of America's cultural history. They were a symbol for rock and roll as well as concert fame. The Beatles sparked a newfound interest in music and concerts for the American people. Following the Beatles to America were many more talented artists looking to increase their fan base, such as the Rolling Stones and The Who. The nation as a whole went out and bought televisions, tickets, and radios just so they could hear their favorite bands perform. This probably decreased productivity, but we know for a fact the consumption went up as a result of ticket sales, advertisements, and merchandise.
To put his war on poverty and great society, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Tax Reduction Act in February of 1964. This act essentially lowered all income taxes from a rate of 20 to 91% to 14 to 70%. In addition, all corporation taxes were reduced by about 5%. Although Johnson intended for this extra cash to be put back into the economy, many consumers decided to save. As we can see, personal savings rise from about 2% to 10% in the next quarter.
Creation of Medicare and Medicaid, July 30th, 1965. President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the bill for Medicare and Medicaid to be introduced into society. Medicare helps the elderly by giving them medical insurance and low-cost hospitalization. Medicaid provides for families with low incomes who need medical services but are not able to afford it on their own. There are standards that individuals must meet that are set up by the state in order to receive Medicare or Medicaid.
In 1961, President John F. Kennedy signed legislation to raise the minimum wage from the then $1 per hour to $1.25 per hour, which was to be put into effect by September of 1963. Kennedy wanted to raise the minimum wage to provide more security for all workers and citizens of the nation. As we can see from the data then, personal savings went up after the law was put into effect, most likely because most of the citizens placed the extra wages into the bank account. However, GDP and domestic investment rise and fell about the same as they would have normally.
The first Super Bowl was on January 15th, 1967. The first Super Bowl game had a significant economic and cultural effect on the economy. This game paved the way for all future Super Bowl games that would come to be even more important. The United States as a whole bought radios and televisions to listen and watch the game. Approximately 100,000 people spent money on tickets to go to this game. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. People became less productive after the assassination of their beloved leader, Martin Luther King Jr. This was the sole effect his death had on the American people. Martin Luther King Jr. had more detractors than supporters, so the effect on the economy he did have was rather minimal. It did, however, affect the people's work performance for a while because many were still sulking in the tragedy.
In 1969, after doing extensive research of the moon and studying the requirements for a lunar landing, NASA finally gave the go-ahead for a mission to the moon. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, along with the less-remembered Michael Collins, made the journey in the summer of 1969. This event was a huge scientific achievement for mankind as well as the United States. It was also a huge government project, and all the spending that went into it helped to stimulate the economy and increase aggregate demand. The total cost of Apollo 11 was around $355 million, without factoring in inflation.
In August of 1969, 3 days of peace and music took place in Bethel, New York. The Free Festival brought in an inordinate amount of festival goers, mainly those part of the counterculture and flower child movement. During this time, we do see gross domestic investment and GDP peak and start to go down. While the social effects of the festival may have been large, the free concert would not have all been